The airport was buzzing with its usual chaos. Families rushing to gates, business travelers tapping away on laptops, and kids dragging oversized backpacks across the polished floors. Lucas Taylor, a middle-aged accountant from Chicago, found a moment of peace amidst the noise as he settled in his seat 22A on Flight 492 to Dallas. It wasn't supposed to be an eventful day. Lucas had flown this route dozens of times for work. Always the same cramped legroom, plastic cups of soda, and bland snack packs. Today was no different. He folded his blazer neatly on his lap, glanced at his watch, and sighed. 2 hours and 20 minutes to Dallas. A simple flight, or so he thought. As passengers trickled onto the plane, Lucas noticed a young man, early 20s maybe, squeezing in a seat 22B next to him. He was tall and lean, wearing a hoodie with the logo of some band Lucas didn't recognize, and carrying a beat-up backpack that looked like it had been through a war zone. The kid barely made eye contact as he sat, plugging earbuds into his ears. Lucas offered a polite nod, though the young man didn't notice. Typical Lucas thought. Kids these days were all the same, glued to their devices, disconnected from the world around them. Lucas leaned back, closing his eyes as the cabin began filling with chatter. But then she arrived. It was impossible not to notice her. A woman, early 60s, elegantly dressed, stood in the aisle, her perfectly manicured fingers clutching a designer handbag. Her expression was one of practiced irritation, as though the entire flight were an inconvenience placed upon her personally. She glanced at the seat numbers, frowned, and then fixed her sharp eyes on Lucas and the young man beside him. Here we go, Lucas thought, shifting uncomfortably. Excuse me, the woman said, her voice cold and commanding. This is my seat. The young man pulled out one earbud, blinking in confusion. What? I think this is my seat. 22B. The woman sniffed, unimpressed. I said my seat. She turned to the flight attendant hovering nearby. Excuse me, miss? I believe there's been a mistake. This young man is in my seat. The flight attendant smiled apologetically and double-checked her tablet. Ma'am, you're in 23B. Just one row back. The woman's face twitched, her composure cracking. Excuse me? I paid for 22B, extra legroom, as you can see. I'm not sitting in 23B like some, she trailed off, glancing pointedly at the young man. Lucas' stomach sank. He'd seen this kind of thing before. The flight attendant's tone remained polite but firm. I'm sorry, Mom. You're assigned to 23B. If you'd like to discuss an upgrade, I can assist you after takeoff. The woman's lips tightened. She looked back at the young man in 22B as though he were something foul stuck to the bottom of her shoe. Unbelievable, she muttered. Of course. Just my luck. She moved to her row with an air of indignation that turned heads, loudly shoving her handbag into the overhead compartment. Lucas didn't dare make eye contact with her. He could already feel it coming, the storm of entitlement that hung in the air like static electricity. Beside him, the young man shifted awkwardly, avoiding everyone's gaze. Lucas glanced at him out of the corner of his eye. Don't worry about her, he said quietly. The kid hesitated before nodding. Yeah, thanks. Lucas settled back into his seat, hoping that would be the end of it. But something about the woman's pointed glances, her muttering under her breath as she sat one row back, told him this flight was about to get a lot more complicated. It was a quiet Wednesday morning, the kind that felt slow and unremarkable. Sunlight filtered through the tall oak trees lining the sleepy downtown streets of Tanner's Creek, a small southern town where time seemed to stretch longer than it should. It was the kind of place where news traveled faster than light, and everyone knew, or thought they knew, everyone else. Judge Nicholas Gray liked it that way. Or at least, that's what he told himself. The soft chime of the bell above the diner's door rang as Nicholas stepped inside, greeted by the smell of fresh-baked biscuits and bacon sizzling on the griddle. Morning light poured through the windows, casting long golden beams over the worn checkerboard floors and the row of old stools at the counter. The diner wasn't glamorous, but it was familiar, its greasy charm a relic of another time. The regulars sat in their usual booths, their voices murmuring low and familiar like the hum of an old engine. Nicholas tucked his tall frame through the doorway, the hem of his tailored navy coat brushing his thighs as he moved. At a glance, he was unassuming, a clean-shaven man in his early 40s, the creases at the corners of his sharp, dark eyes hinting at years of wisdom. His skin, a deep coffee brown, was smooth and polished, the kind that made him look both timeless and ageless. He carried himself with quiet dignity, the type of man whose presence turned heads without effort, yet his calm demeanor seemed to deflect unwanted attention. Judge Gray was well known here, his reputation as a fair but firm arbiter of the law reaching every corner of Tanner's Creek and the neighboring towns. What most didn't know, or chose not to acknowledge, was the depth of his success beyond the creaky walls of the county courthouse. Nicholas wasn't just another small-town judge. He sat on the state's Judicial Ethics Board with years of accolades and decisions that had shaped lives and policies. He owned a sprawling home up on the ridge, though he rarely mentioned it, and drove a sleek black Range Rover that he always parked 2 blocks away from the diner, lest it invite questions he didn't feel like answering. He didn't need attention. Humility had always been his greatest strength, even when others mistook it for weakness. Morning, Judge Gray called Donna from behind the counter, her blonde ponytail bouncing as she wiped her hands on a grease-streaked rag. Her smile was broad, with a warmth that could almost make a man forget he wasn't family. The usual? Nicholas nodded, his lips curling into a small smile. You know me too well, Donna. Eggs over easy, sausage, and black coffee coming right up, she chirped, already turning toward the grill. He slid onto a stool near the end of the counter, one of the quieter spots where he could observe without being observed. Outside, the early morning traffic crawled lazily by. A rusty pickup truck, a tired sedan, a man on a bike lugging a cart of tools behind him. Tanner's Creek didn't move fast, but then again, it didn't need to. Nicholas didn't mind. Most of the time. You back in town for good, Judge? The question came from an older man sitting 2 stools away, a farmer Nicholas knew by sight, but not by name. The man's hands were calloused and stained from decades of hard labor, his shirt more dust than fabric. Just here for a few weeks, Nicholas replied evenly. Court's picking up again, and I'm scheduled for a handful of hearings. The man grunted, eyeing him curiously. Must be nice sitting on that bench. Bet you don't have to get your hands dirty much. Nicholas felt the corners of his mouth twitch, but he resisted the urge to reply in kind. He wasn't here to spar with old-timers who didn't know better. Sometimes the dirt's just harder to see, he said quietly. The man snorted and turned back to his newspaper, clearly unimpressed. Nicholas let it go. Over the years, he'd grown accustomed to moments like these. Subtle barbs, casual dismissals. It wasn't new. Success, when worn by a black man, came with strings attached. People here didn't question the white lawyers who drove shiny cars or the real estate moguls with gold watches. But Nicholas, a black judge from nowhere, he'd spent a lifetime proving that he belonged in spaces where others thought he didn't. And yet, even with all his success, here in Tanner's Creek, there were always whispers. The door chimed again. Nicholas didn't look up at first, until a sharp voice cut through the din. Well, look at this place. It's cute, isn't it? The voice belonged to a woman, crisp, high-pitched, and unmistakably out of place. Nicholas turned his head slightly, his eyes catching on a pair of strangers stepping into the diner. The woman was in her mid-50s, dressed head to toe in cream-colored silk that looked wildly out of place against the diner's faded booths. Her shoes clicked sharply against the tiled floor, and her oversized sunglasses sat perched atop her flawlessly styled platinum bob. Behind her followed a man, tall, graying at the temples, his suit tailored so perfectly it was almost smug. A heavy gold watch gleamed on his wrist as he adjusted the cuffs of his jacket. Nicholas recognized their type instantly. Wealthy, northern, and entirely too accustomed to getting their way. "Can we get a table?" the woman asked loudly, scanning the room as though it offended her. Her sharp gaze landed on Donna, who had paused mid-step, spatula in hand. "Anywhere you'd like, ma'am," Donna replied, though her tone had lost its earlier cheer. The woman sniffed and made her way to a booth near the window, heels clicking like an executioner's drumbeat. The man followed, though his eyes landed on Nicholas as he passed. He paused just briefly, his gaze lingering a little longer than necessary, An appraisal? Or maybe a question? But Nicholas didn't blink. After a moment, the man moved on, sliding into the booth across from the woman. Nicholas turned back to his coffee. This wasn't his problem. New folks? Donna asked under her breath as she walked past, dropping Nicholas' plate in front of him. Looks like it, he murmured. Tourists, maybe. Or real estate investors. Either way, they're not staying long. Nicholas didn't disagree. Tanner's Creek wasn't the sort of place you stopped unless you had to. But as he cut into his eggs, the voices from the booth drifted toward him, too loud to ignore. I don't see why we're wasting our time here, the woman snapped. This town doesn't even have a proper bank, let alone a luxury market. Patience, Beth, the man replied, his voice smooth but edged with irritation. We're here for one reason. Finish the paperwork, and we're gone. Beth made a noise of disgust. And this is where that judge is from? You'd think someone with his credentials would live somewhere civilized. I'm surprised they even let him preside over anything here. Nicholas froze. His fork paused midair, the eggs slipping back onto the plate. The woman's words hung in the air like the sharp tang of metal. Casual, dismissive, but heavy with implication. He wasn't surprised. Not really. People like her assumed power could only wear one kind of face, and it wasn't his. But what Beth didn't realize was that he was the very judge she spoke of. Nicholas set his fork down quietly, the faint scrape against the plate cutting through the low murmur of the diner. Donna, overhearing the conversation, shot him a worried glance, but he offered her a calm, reassuring nod. This wasn't the first time someone underestimated him. It wouldn't be the last. Nicholas pushed his plate slightly aside, the weight of Beth's words lingering like a bitter aftertaste. He'd heard things like this before. Prejudice wrapped in casual conversation, the kind that cloaked itself in ignorance rather than overt hostility. But something about her tone, sharp and dismissive, gnawed at him more than usual. A judge from a place like this. As if his accomplishments were unearned. As if his presence in the halls of power was an aberration. Taking a sip of his coffee, Nicholas resolved to ignore it. People like her weren't worth the energy. Still, old lessons rose in his mind. Patience is strength, restrained is power. His father had taught him that long before the bar exam, long before he'd worn a robe and held a gavel. But then Beth's voice carried again. Well, if we're done here, I'd like to check out that little shop next door. This diner is giving me hives. She punctuated her statement with a pointed wipe of her napkin across the table. The man, presumably her husband, sighed but didn't argue. Fine, let's get it over with. The pair rose from their booth, Beth smoothing the non-existent wrinkles from her silk blouse. Nicholas didn't look up, though he felt Beth's gaze linger on him for the briefest moment as they passed. Donna reappeared at his side, her voice low. You okay, Judge? Nicholas glanced at her, the concern in her eyes plain. Donna wasn't blind to the undercurrents of life in Tanner's Creek. I'm fine, he said, his tone light but measured. Some people carry their own storms, Donna. Doesn't mean I need to stand in the rain. She smiled at that, though the worry didn't quite leave her face. You're a better man than me. I'd have told her where to stick that attitude. Nicholas chuckled softly, more for her benefit than his own. He paid his bill, leaving a generous tip as always, and stepped back into the late morning sun. The shop Beth had mentioned sat just a few doors down, its quaint sign reading Latham's Antiques and Curiosities. It was one of those small-town storefronts that smelled of lemon polish and history, crammed with relics no one needed, but everyone wanted to touch. Nicholas wasn't planning to stop, but something about the scene unfolding just beyond the glass doors gave him pause. Beth stood near the center of the shop, holding a small porcelain vase between her manicured fingers. She was mid-conversation with Mr. Latham, the shop's aging owner, a wiry man with thin spectacles and a voice as shaky as his hands. It's lovely, Beth said, though her tone oozed condescension. But surely this can't be authentic. It doesn't look very valuable. Nicholas could see Mr. Latham fidgeting, his discomfort obvious. The shop was his pride, though it didn't take much to see the place wasn't thriving. Beth's words hung like insults disguised as observations. Nicholas exhaled through his nose. He should have walked on, but his instincts nudged him toward the door. Inside, the bell overhead chimed, drawing Beth's sharp gaze as Nicholas entered. Her lips thinned immediately, as though he'd committed some unseen offense simply by existing in the same space. Mr. Latham turned, visibly relieved for the distraction. "Judge Gray," he called, his voice lifting. "Good to see you. Haven't had you in here for some time." "Been keeping busy," Nicholas replied, offering the older man a polite nod as he moved deeper into the shop. Beth's eyes narrowed slightly at the exchange. "You know him?" she asked Mr. Latham, her voice quieter but no less pointed. Mr. Latham looked puzzled. "Of course. Judge Gray's been a cornerstone of this town for years now." Beth didn't respond right away, though Nicholas could feel her studying him. This time was something that felt more pointed than curiosity. She looked him up and down, as if trying to reconcile the image of a humble, sharply dressed black man with the authority implied by the word judge. Nicholas didn't react. He was used to this look. It always started with surprise, like his existence broke some unspoken rule. "Isn't that something?" Beth murmured finally. Her tone seemed neutral on the surface, but Nicholas caught the edge beneath it, like a knife hidden in velvet. Nicholas browsed the shop quietly, ignoring the heavy awareness of Beth's presence. He moved along the shelves, pausing to examine an old pocket watch that ticked faintly behind its dusty glass. The quiet should have felt peaceful, but it was cut through by Beth's continued voice as she returned her attention to Mr. Latham. "Well, I'll take the vase. It's charming, even if it's not worth much." She reached in her bag and pulled out a sleek wallet. "Though for future reference, you might want to upgrade your inventory. People expect a certain standard, you know." Nicholas turned slightly, just in time to see Mr. Latham's cheeks flush red. He stammered something polite, but Beth was already handing over a crisp $100 bill with a faint smirk. Nicholas pressed his lips into a line, his patience thinning. It wasn't his fight. It didn't need to be. But as Beth turned to leave, she paused near him, holding her new purchase as though it might bite her. "You're Judge Gray, are you?" she asked, her voice loud enough to feel deliberate. Nicholas met her gaze evenly, his expression giving away nothing. "I am." Beth smiled faintly, though it didn't touch her eyes. "Well, that's surprising. You don't look like the judges I'm used to." The words hung heavy in the air, and for the briefest moment, the shop went still. Nicholas' eyes sharpened, but he didn't rise to the bait. "Looks can be deceiving," he replied calmly. Beth blinked, perhaps taken aback by his refusal to play her game. She looked as though she might say more, but her husband appeared behind her, glancing impatiently at his watch. "Beth, let's go. We got a meeting to make." Beth hesitated, giving Nicholas one last look, this time with something resembling challenge, before sweeping toward the door with her husband trailing close behind. The bell jingled as the door swung shut, leaving Nicholas and Mr. Latham in the shop's charged silence. "Sorry about that, Judge," Mr. Latham said quietly, his shoulders sagging. "Some folks just don't know how to mind their manners." Nicholas exhaled, the tension slowly easing from his chest. "You don't need to apologize, Mr. Latham." But as he glanced back toward the now empty door, Nicholas felt the flicker of something deeper than irritation, something closer to foreboding. People like Beth didn't know how to leave things alone. Nicholas returned to the courthouse later that afternoon. Tanner's Creek Courthouse sat on the edge of town, an old red-brick building with weathered columns that looked tired but resolute, much like the town itself. Inside, the marble floors gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights, the sound of Nicholas' footsteps echoing through the quiet halls. He paused outside his office door, unlocking it with a soft click. The afternoon's docket sat neatly on his desk, a reminder of the work ahead. Nicholas picked it up, his eyes scanning the list of cases, small-town disputes, property arguments, nothing out of the ordinary. But then he noticed something. Near the bottom of the docket was a name he hadn't expected to see: Elizabeth and David Chambers. Nicholas felt his stomach drop slightly. The couple from the diner, the couple from Latham's shop, were scheduled for a property dispute hearing the very next day. His lips pressed into a thin line. Life, it seemed, had an odd sense of timing. Nicholas sat at his desk long after the sun had dipped below the horizon, the quiet of the courthouse deepening around him. Tomorrow's hearing would be like any other on the surface, a dispute over a piece of land. But Nicholas knew better. Tomorrow wouldn't just be about the law. It would be a test, a reminder of how quickly people could judge a man not by his deeds, but by the color of his skin. And this time, they would see exactly who Nicholas Gray was. The next morning, the courthouse felt different. It wasn't anything visible, just a slight charge in the air, like the calm before a storm. Nicholas arrived earlier than usual, the morning fog still clinging to the old brick facade as he climbed the steps to his chambers. He greeted the security guard, George, with his usual nod and headed straight for his office. The docket sat waiting on his desk, the name Elizabeth and David Chambers circled in faint pencil, as though his clerk had found it curious but didn't dare comment. Nicholas studied the case details for the 5th time that morning. It was a dispute over a small tract of land between the Chambers family and a local farmer, Thomas Greer, an older black man who'd lived on that property for decades. The file was straightforward, but Nicholas knew it wouldn't play out that way. Not today. By mid-morning, the courtroom was packed. Tanner's Creek rarely saw this kind of turnout. Mostly neighbors showing up to hear about zoning disputes or petty thefts, but word had spread. Elizabeth Beth Chambers, wife of David Chambers, the well-known developer, was in court. Her name carried weight in circles that cared about such things, and that meant people wanted to see her win or see her fall. Nicholas entered the room, his black robes a stark contrast to the faded oak paneling. Heads turned as he approached the bench, the murmur of conversation falling into silence. "All rise," the bailiff called, his voice echoing through the small space. Nicholas nodded as he took his seat, his eyes sweeping the room. On one side sat Beth and David, their polished appearance at odds with the worn benches and dusty courthouse. On the other side, Thomas Greer sat in his Sunday best, a fraying suit and scuffed shoes, his hands folded tightly in his lap. His lawyer, a young man from a nearby town, whispered quietly to him. Beth's gaze locked onto Nicholas as he settled behind the bench. There it was again, that faint, incredulous disbelief that he was the one presiding over her case. Nicholas kept his expression neutral, but inside his patience was wearing thin. "Let's proceed," Nicholas said, his voice calm, as he motioned for the proceedings to begin. The early arguments were routine, almost boring. Thomas Greer's lawyer laid out the facts. Thomas had lived and worked that piece of land for nearly 30 years. There was no formal deed in his name, but local agreements and years of payment records supported his claim. The Chamberses, however, insisted that the land had reverted back to the previous owner, who had sold it to them fair and square. Beth's voice cut through the courtroom when she took the stand. "We've done nothing wrong," she said, her words clipped and sharp. "My husband and I followed the law. We bought the property legally. I don't know why we're even having this conversation." Nicholas studied her as she spoke. There was no remorse, no acknowledgement of the man across the room whose life was entwined with that land. To Beth, it was business. Nothing more. "Mrs. Chambers," Nicholas said evenly, "are you aware of Mr. Greer's long history on this land?" Beth's lips curled faintly, her polished confidence unwavering. "I'm aware of it, but that doesn't make it his. Sentiment doesn't hold up in court." The room grew quieter. Nicholas saw Thomas Greer shift slightly, his lined face unreadable. Beth wasn't wrong, technically. The law, Nicholas knew better than anyone, could be a double-edged sword. As the morning wore on, the tension in the room thickened. Nicholas noticed small things. David Chambers' impatience as he whispered to his lawyer. Beth's pointed glances in his direction, as though daring him to challenge her. And then there were the onlookers. Townspeople who'd come to watch, their reactions mixed between curiosity and quiet judgment. During a brief recess, Nicholas returned to his chambers, closing the door softly behind him. He rubbed his temples, trying to gather his thoughts. The facts were plain, but facts weren't always enough. This case wasn't just about land. It was about power, who had it, who didn't, and how far someone like Beth Chambers would go to keep it. A sharp knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." The door opened, and Mitchell, his clerk, stepped in. Mitchell was young, fresh out of law school, and still carried the weight of idealism on his shoulders. "Judge Gray," Mitchell began, hesitation in his voice. "I thought you should know. There's talk outside." Nicholas raised an eyebrow. Talk. Mitchell shifted uneasily. Some of the folks out there are saying you shouldn't be on this case. Nicholas froze. Why? Mitchell glanced down, his face red. They're saying, well, Mrs. Chambers is claiming you're biased. The words hit Nicholas like a slap. Biased. The accusation was as old as time, a weapon wielded against any black man in a position of authority. He took a steadying breath, his fingers curling slightly against the desk. And what exactly is her claim? Mitchell hesitated before answering. She told a few people that you've had an interest in this kind of case before, that you'd take care of your own. Nicholas' jaw tightened, though he kept his voice level. Thank you, Mitchell. That'll be all. As Mitchell left, Nicholas sat in the silence of his chambers, his mind racing. Take care of your own. It wasn't just an insult. It was an attack on his integrity, his career, and everything he stood for. The courtroom was quieter when Nicholas returned. Beth sat in her seat, her arms crossed, her eyes flicking toward him with a look that was almost smug. Whatever whispers she'd spread during the recess had done their job. Nicholas took his seat and straightened his back, his voice firm as he called the court to order. We'll continue. Thomas Greer's lawyer resumed his closing arguments, his voice earnest, but shaking slightly under the weight of the room. Nicholas watched as Thomas sat quietly, his hands still folded, his shoulders hunched against the invisible weight he carried. When it was the chamber's turn, Beth's lawyer rose, his tone practiced and confident. This is a simple matter of legal ownership, he said smoothly. The Chamberses have followed the law. Mr. Greer's emotional attachment, while understandable, does not override legal documentation. It's unfortunate, but the law must be upheld. Beth's gaze flickered to Nicholas again, as if daring him to contradict her lawyer's words. Nicholas listened to every word, his expression unreadable. When the lawyer finished, he set his notes down and addressed the room. This court will take a brief recess to deliberate. Nicholas rose and disappeared through the door behind the bench, the sound of whispers filling the room as he left. In the quiet of his chambers, Nicholas stood by the window, staring out at the town he had spent his life serving. The accusations weighed on him, heavier than they should have. He knew the law. He knew the right call. But this wasn't just about the law. It was about perception. How quickly someone like him could be painted as biased for showing fairness to a black man like Thomas Greer. Beth's accusations weren't random. They were calculated. A knock came at his door. Judge Gray. It was Mitchell again. Come in, Nicholas said. Mitchell entered, his expression troubled. Sir, I just saw Mrs. Chambers talking to Officer Daniels outside. Nicholas turned sharply. Officer Daniels? Mitchell nodded. She was saying something about feeling unsafe. About you being personally invested. Nicholas exhaled slowly, forcing down the anger rising in his chest. He knew exactly what she was doing, spreading doubt, planting seeds. Beth Chambers was used to getting her way, and if she couldn't win the case, she'd find a way to tear him down in the process. Nicholas straightened his tie, his resolve hardening. Thank you, Mitchell. I'll handle it. Mitchell hesitated. Judge, do you need me to? No, Nicholas cut him off gently. This ends here. He turned and walked back toward the courtroom, his steps steady, his mind clear. As Nicholas stepped back behind the bench, the room fell silent again. Beth's gaze followed him like a shadow, smug and expectant. Whatever she had planned, she was waiting for him to stumble, to give her one more reason to call him unfit. Nicholas cleared his throat. I've reached a decision. The words hung in the air, and every face turned toward him, waiting. But before he could continue, the double doors of the courtroom banged open. Officer Daniels entered, his expression tight as he walked straight toward the bench. Judge Gray, Daniels said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm going to need a word with you. The entire room froze. Nicholas stared at Daniels, his face impassive even as his heart began to pound. Beth smiled faintly, victorious. The weight of Officer Daniels' presence turned the air in the courtroom heavy and still. All eyes shifted to him as he strode toward the bench with the kind of swagger that comes from knowing you hold power, or at least the illusion of it. His uniform was crisp, the silver badge on his chest catching the light as he stopped just below Nicholas' elevated seat. Judge Gray, Daniels said again, his voice booming with artificial authority. "I'm going to need you to come with me." The words hung in the room like an unspoken threat. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, shock and confusion spreading like wildfire. Nicholas remained seated, his expression calm, but inside, his pulse began to pound. Daniels' eyes glinted with something he recognized, a challenge. "Officer Daniels," Nicholas replied evenly, his voice measured. "I'm in the middle of a court proceeding. If you have an issue, it can be addressed after the case is resolved." Daniels smirked faintly, clearly pleased to have an audience. He shifted his weight, making sure every spectator, every whispering onlooker, could see his confidence. "This is urgent, Judge. I've received a complaint from Mrs. Elizabeth Chambers, claiming there's a conflict of interest here," Daniels said, glancing back toward Beth, who sat smugly in her seat. "She says you've got a bias against her and her family. Says you're acting unprofessionally." Nicholas' jaw tightened, though he maintained his composure. The bait was clear, and Daniels had already swallowed it. This wasn't about justice or law. It was a performance. For Daniels, for Beth, for anyone who would watch. He stood slowly, his black robe swishing softly as he straightened to his full height. "Officer Daniels, I trust you know the procedures. Complaints about a presiding judge are filed formally through the State Judiciary Commission, not through the sheriff's office, and certainly not in the middle of a proceeding." Daniels' smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "That's all well and good, Judge, but I've been asked to remove you from the bench until this matter is resolved." The room gasped as Daniels' words settled. Nicholas could feel the eyes on him now, waiting to see how he would react. Beth leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms, satisfaction etched into every line of her face. Mitchell, standing near the clerk's desk, looked as though he wanted to speak, but his mouth hung open in disbelief. Thomas Greer, on the other side of the room, looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Nicholas' mind worked quickly. Daniels didn't have the authority to remove him from the bench. This was unprecedented, improper, illegal even. And yet it was happening. In Tanner's Creek, where perception mattered more than facts, Daniels' presence was enough to undermine him. Nicholas stepped down from the bench, his movements deliberate and graceful. He would not be dragged into the chaos Daniels and Beth were trying to create. The audience's murmurs grew louder, but he ignored them. "Very well," Nicholas said coolly, meeting Daniels' gaze head-on. "But know this. What you're doing will not hold up. You've overstepped." Daniels shrugged, his smirk returning. "We'll see about that." Beth's voice broke the silence. "This is just further proof that you're unfit to preside over this case." Nicholas turned his gaze to her. "Mrs. Chambers, I would be very careful about making accusations you can't support." She only smirked, her eyes gleaming with self-satisfaction. Outside the courtroom, Nicholas was led to a small office down the hall. Ironically, one of the witness rooms he'd spent years using during trials. Daniels followed closely behind him, his every movement deliberate. Once inside, the officer closed the door, the sharp click of the lock feeling louder than it should have. "You've got a problem, Judge," Daniels said, arms crossed as he leaned against the doorframe. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" Nicholas turned slowly to face him, his calm exterior beginning to crack, though only slightly. "This has nothing to do with me, and everything to do with Mrs. Chambers trying to manipulate the system. And now, it seems you're complicit in that." Daniels' smirk darkened. "Watch your tone. You're the one on thin ice here." Words already spreading. "You think anyone's going to back you up?" Nicholas stepped forward, closing the space between them, though his posture remained unthreatening. "I know exactly who I am and what I stand for, Officer Daniels. I suggest you ask yourself if you can say the same." For a brief moment, Daniels hesitated, as if Nicholas' calm resolve unnerved him. But before the silence could settle, a knock sounded at the door. "Judge Gray." Mitchell's voice was shaky but clear. Daniels unlocked the door reluctantly, allowing Mitchell to step in, his face pale. "Judge," Mitchell said breathlessly, "I just spoke with the State Judiciary Commission. There's no formal complaint on file. Daniels has no authority to do this." Nicholas nodded, unsurprised. "Thank you, Mitchell." Daniels straightened, his cocky demeanor faltering as Mitchell's words sank in. "This isn't over," he muttered, though the bravado in his voice had weakened. "Oh, I'm sure it's not," Nicholas replied, his tone sharp now, cutting through Daniel's bluster like glass. "But let me be perfectly clear. You've embarrassed yourself and undermined the integrity of this courthouse. The next time you attempt to interfere in my court, you'd better come with a warrant and a legitimate reason." Daniel's face flushed, but he said nothing. He pushed past Mitchell, his boots thudding heavily down the hall. Mitchell let out a shaky breath. "Judge, what do we do now?" Nicholas turned to his young clerk, his voice firm and steady. "We go back to the courtroom." When Nicholas stepped back into the room, the energy shifted. Whispers stopped mid-sentence as all eyes turned to him. He walked to the bench with slow, purposeful strides and settled back into his seat. Beth's smug expression faltered as he looked directly at her. "This court will resume," Nicholas announced, his voice clear and authoritative. "Let me remind everyone that the law, not personal opinions, governs this courtroom. We will proceed with impartiality, and any further attempts to disrupt these proceedings will be met with swift consequences." He didn't look at Beth, but he didn't need to. The silence that followed was thick and oppressive, her influence over the room now noticeably weakened. Thomas Greer sat a little straighter, his lawyer nodding faintly with renewed confidence. Even the spectators seemed quieter, as though they sensed something had shifted. Nicholas' gaze lingered on Beth for just a moment before turning back to the docket. "Let's continue." Beth's eyes narrowed, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface, but she said nothing. For the first time, she looked unsure, her carefully constructed plan beginning to crumble. Outside the courthouse, Officer Daniels paced near his cruiser, his phone pressed to his ear. "It didn't work," he muttered. "The judge called my bluff. What do you want me to do now?" Beth's voice crackled on the other end. "It's not over. Not yet. If the law won't take him down, we'll find another way." Daniel's jaw clenched as he listened, the veins in his neck pulsing. "Fine," he said finally, "but you're on your own for the next move." He ended the call, glancing back at the courthouse with a sneer. Inside, Nicholas Gray's courtroom remained a symbol of quiet strength. For now, Nicholas sat alone in his chambers, the steady tick of the clock on the wall the only sound in the room. Outside, the courthouse bustled with its usual rhythm, but the energy had changed. He could feel it, an undercurrent of tension, of whispers carried from hall to hall. They were talking about him, about bias, about how quickly the powerful could turn the system against those they feared or those they hated. Nicholas took a slow breath, his mind sharp. He couldn't let anger guide him, no matter how justified it felt. This was about more than him. This was about the integrity of the law and the example he set for those who came after. A sharp knock rattled the door. Nicholas straightened, his face a mask of calm. "Come in." The door creaked open, and Officer Daniels strode inside without invitation. His boots scuffed against the floor, his demeanor dripping with self-importance. Behind him, Elizabeth Chambers followed, her silk blouse flawless despite the simmering resentment etched into her expression. Daniels, emboldened by her presence, crossed his arms over his chest. "We need to talk," Daniels said, his tone hard. Nicholas didn't rise. He let them come to him. He leaned back in his chair, his calm gaze locking on Daniels like a vice. "I wasn't aware I sent for either of you." Beth scoffed, stepping forward with a pointed sneer. "Oh, please, Judge Gray. Let's stop pretending this is about professionalism. You're holding up this case because of him, that man who claims he owns our land. You're protecting your own." Nicholas' brow lifted fractionally, the only hint of his rising frustration. "Mrs. Chambers, I suggest you tread carefully. Accusations without evidence will not be tolerated in my courtroom." Daniel stepped forward, his voice louder now, like he wanted to fill every corner of the room. "This isn't just an accusation, Judge. People are talking. They're questioning whether you should even be here." Nicholas didn't flinch. "I've heard the rumors, Officer Daniels. I expected as much. The problem for you, and for Mrs. Chambers, is that rumors don't hold up in the face of facts. And I deal in facts." Beth's face flushed, but her voice sharpened. "We'll see what the facts say when we take this to the State Board. We'll have your robe and your career, and there won't be a damn thing you can do about it. Nicholas rose then, slow and deliberate, every inch of his frame a quiet command. The room seemed to shrink around him as he stepped out from behind his desk, closing the distance between himself and the pair of them. "Mrs. Chambers, Officer Daniels," Nicholas began, his voice low, but cutting through the air like a blade. "Do you understand what you're doing?" Daniels opened his mouth to speak, but Nicholas raised a hand. Just a simple gesture, but it silenced him. "You think you can come into my courtroom, question my integrity, and twist the law to serve your own purposes," Nicholas continued. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that is?" Beth smirked, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "The only danger here is a judge who doesn't know his place." Daniels chuckled, but the sound was forced. "You should have kept your head down, Judge. People like you." Nicholas turned sharply to Daniels, the movement sudden enough to make the officer stiffen. "People like me?" Nicholas said, his voice icy. "Careful, officer. Finish that sentence, and you'll find out exactly how much authority I hold." Daniel swallowed hard, his bravado cracking. Nicholas leaned closer, his tone steady but unyielding. "I've spent my entire life working for this title, for the right to sit in that courtroom and serve justice. And yet, here you are, desperate to take me down, not because I've done anything wrong, but because you can't stand seeing a black man with authority. Don't think I don't see it." Beth's smug veneer cracked. She looked at Daniels, waiting for him to jump in, but the officer looked away. The words hung in the room like thunder before a storm. Nicholas straightened, his composure unshaken. "Now, let me be clear. Your accusations are baseless, and any attempt to take this further will result in repercussions you aren't ready for. You've underestimated me, like so many before you." Beth opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, there was another knock at the door. This time it was Mitchell, his face flushed with urgency. "Judge Gray," he said breathlessly, holding a stack of papers. "You'll want to see this." Nicholas turned, accepting the documents as Daniels and Beth exchanged wary glances. Nicholas' eyes scanned the pages quickly, each word solidifying his position. He smiled faintly, a victorious calm settling over him. "You didn't think this through, did you?" Nicholas asked softly, holding up the papers for them to see. "These are the official land records, certified and indisputable. Mr. Greer's claim to that property predates your purchase. In short, Mrs. Chambers, you bought land that didn't belong to the seller. Legally, the title never transferred to you." Beth's face drained of color. "That can't be right. We paid for that land, and you'll need to take that up with the seller," Nicholas replied smoothly. "But as far as this court is concerned, Mr. Greer's ownership is upheld. The facts don't lie." Daniels stepped forward, his voice tight with desperation. "Now, wait a minute. This isn't." Nicholas turned to him, his voice sharp as a gavel. "I'd sit this one out if I were you, Officer Daniels. You've already overstepped your authority. I'll be filing a formal complaint about your conduct today. Your badge doesn't give you the right to circumvent the law." Daniels' face reddened, but he said nothing, his shoulders slumping slightly under the weight of his failure. Beth, on the other hand, sputtered, her polished confidence completely shattered. "You can't do this. I'll go to the board. I'll go to the governor. You'll regret this." Nicholas stared at her, his expression calm and unwavering. "I don't regret standing for what's right, Mrs. Chambers. And if you think you can intimidate me, then you haven't been paying attention." For a moment, the room went still. Beth looked ready to scream, but there was nothing left for her to say. Her plan had crumbled, and the truth lay bare for all to see. Nicholas turned to Mitchell, handing the documents back. "Have these added to the case file, and make sure Mr. Greer's attorney receives a copy immediately." "Yes, sir," Mitchell said, a wide smile breaking through his earlier anxiety. Nicholas turned his back to Beth and Daniels, moving toward the door. He paused for just a moment, his voice carrying across the room without turning to face them. "This conversation is over." Outside the courthouse, the crowd had gathered. Locals, reporters, and curious faces all craning their necks for a glimpse of what had happened. When Nicholas stepped out, his head held high, the murmurs followed him, rippling through the crowd like waves. Behind him, Beth and Daniels emerged, their expressions sour, their power diminished. Beth pulled her sunglasses on as though they could hide her humiliation, while Daniels trailed behind her, no longer carrying himself like a man in control. Nicholas descended the steps, his footsteps steady. At the bottom, Thomas Greer stood waiting, his hat in hand. When Nicholas reached him, Thomas met his gaze with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Judge," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. Nicholas nodded, offering a small, steady smile. "The truth always wins, Mr. Greer, even when they try to bury it." Thomas held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. "God bless you for that." Nicholas turned back to the crowd, the energy buzzing as people began to disperse. The battle wasn't completely over. He knew Beth Chambers would try to fight this in other ways. But for now, the law had prevailed. As he walked to his car, Nicholas let out a long breath, the weight of the confrontation still sitting on his shoulders. He had stood his ground, but the fight wasn't finished. Not yet. He opened the car door, pausing for just a moment to look back at the courthouse, the symbol of everything he fought to protect. They'd try to shake him. They'd try to tear him down. But Nicholas Gray was still standing. The courtroom was silent, a silence so taut it felt ready to snap. Nicholas stood at the bench, his dark robe heavy on his shoulders. Across the room, Elizabeth Chambers sat with a smug expression that told him she believed she'd won. Officer Daniels lingered near the doorway like an enforcer, arms crossed and chin raised. The energy in the room had shifted. No longer a space for the fair execution of justice, but a stage where power and bias wrestled for control. Nicholas had been here before. Maybe not in this exact room with these exact faces, but he'd fought battles like this his entire life, each one testing how much he could endure, how far he could bend without breaking. "Judge Gray," Daniels said, his voice sharp and loud, cutting through the silence. "We need you to recuse yourself from this case. Immediately." The demand hung in the air, a statement disguised as an order. Nicholas let the moment stretch, his gaze sweeping the room. The spectators, locals, neighbors, curious faces, looked back at him, some with confusion, others with doubt. The seed had been planted, and Daniels had watered it well. Nicholas met Daniels' stare. "On what grounds, officer?" Daniels shrugged, a calculated move that screamed casual arrogance. "Bias. That's the word being passed around, isn't it? You're protecting Mr. Greer because he's one of your own?" A murmur rippled through the room. Nicholas' jaw tightened, though his expression remained composed. "Bias is a serious accusation. Do you have evidence to support that claim?" Beth leaned forward, her voice dripping with faux innocence. "Your Honor, it's not personal. We just want a fair trial. And given the circumstances," she paused, letting the implication linger, "I think the reasonable thing is for you to step down. Surely you can see how this looks." "How this looks?" Nicholas' gaze turned to Beth, studying her carefully. There it was, her true weapon. Not facts, not law, but perception. A black judge presiding over a case involving a black man. She was twisting the narrative, making it about race when she was the only one weaponizing it. Nicholas took a deep breath, his voice even and steady. "Mrs. Chambers, Officer Daniels," he began, each word precise. "This is not about fairness. It's not about the law. It's about power. You're attempting to undermine this court, to twist justice to serve your interests, and I won't allow it." Beth's mask slipped just slightly, her lips thinning into a hard line. Daniels, however, wasn't finished. He stepped forward, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. "You don't get to decide that," Daniels said, his voice rising. "You're just another judge in another backwater town. You think your word carries weight outside these walls." The room gasped softly at the insult, but Nicholas didn't flinch. He had faced worse. He had survived worse. "My authority comes from the law, officer," Nicholas replied sharply, his voice cutting through the room. "Not from your opinion." Daniels laughed bitterly, his bravado building as he realized he had an audience. "Law? That's rich coming from you. I've seen it time and again. People like you abusing the system for your own." Nicholas' eyes darkened, but he remained composed. "People like me?" Daniels sneered. "Yeah, people who think they're untouchable. who think they can rewrite the rules just because... Enough! Nicholas' voice boomed across the room, silencing Daniel's mid-sentence. Nicholas' hands gripped the edge of the bench, his posture a pillar of authority. I've spent decades serving the law, Nicholas continued, his voice low but unshakable. I've built my career on fairness, integrity, and justice. But here you are, standing in my courtroom, insulting my position, my character, and my right to be here. Not because I've failed the law, but because you can't stomach the truth. You can't accept that a man like me holds this gavel. The room was still, every eye fixed on him. Even Daniel seemed caught off guard, his bluster faltering under Nicholas' unwavering gaze. You want me to step down? Nicholas continued, his voice rising, his anger no longer hidden but controlled. Then make your case. Bring your evidence. Show this court where I've failed to act with integrity. But if you think you can intimidate me with whispers and baseless accusations, you're gravely mistaken. Daniel's face flushed red. This isn't over. Oh, but it is, Nicholas shot back, his tone firm. You've crossed the line, Officer Daniels. And when this is done, I'll make sure your conduct is reviewed. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't dare say more. The crowd watched him, their murmurs now shifting. Doubt was dissolving, replaced by something else. Respect. Understanding. They saw it now. The way Daniels and Beth had tried to manipulate the system, how they'd weaponized Nicholas' skin color and authority against him. Beth rose abruptly from her seat, her face pale but angry. This is ridiculous, she snapped, her voice sharp. I'll take this to the state board, to the governor, to anyone who will listen. Nicholas looked at her, his voice quiet but final. Do what you feel you must, Mrs. Chambers. But the truth doesn't change, no matter how loudly you shout over it. The courtroom emptied slowly after that, the crowd dissipating in hushed waves. Beth and Daniels lingered near the exit, speaking in low, furious tones, but neither dared to meet Nicholas' gaze as he left the bench. Outside the courtroom doors, Nicholas paused. Mitchell was waiting for him, his face bright with relief. You shut them down, sir, Mitchell said breathlessly, his admiration clear. That was incredible. Nicholas gave a faint smile, though the weight of the moment still pressed against him. It's not over yet, Mitchell. Mitchell's smile faltered. What do you mean? Nicholas' gaze drifted down the hall, where Beth and Daniels were now walking toward the exit. He could see it in their posture, in the way Beth's phone was already pressed to her ear. This fight wasn't finished. They weren't giving up. People like Beth Chambers don't lose quietly, Nicholas murmured. And people like Officer Daniels don't let go of power easily. Mitchell swallowed, his enthusiasm dimmed. What do we do now? Nicholas straightened, his expression calm but resolute. We stand firm, and we keep moving forward. That's how you win. Mitchell nodded, a flicker of determination sparking in his eyes. Nicholas turned and walked toward his chambers, his steps slow and measured. Outside, the late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows along the courthouse floor. The battle had reached its peak, but Nicholas knew better than to declare victory too soon. Beth and Daniels would regroup, and they would come at him again, harder, louder, more desperate. As he opened the door to his chambers, he paused, looking back over his shoulder at the quiet, empty hallway. For now, the truth had held. But the fight wasn't over. The morning sun streamed through Nicholas' office window, its light cutting through the shadows that had clung to him over the past few days. The courthouse had returned to its usual rhythm, papers shuffling, doors opening and closing, murmurs of ongoing cases drifting through the air. On the surface, everything seemed unchanged. But beneath it all, Tanner's Creek was buzzing. The events of the previous day had shaken the town, exposing cracks in the carefully constructed walls of power that people like Beth Chambers and Officer Daniels relied on. Rumors swirled, shifting like sand, twisting and stretching the truth. But one thing was certain. Nicholas Gray hadn't backed down. Nicholas sat at his desk, flipping through a thick folder of paperwork. The land case had been formally resolved earlier that morning. Thomas Greer now had undisputed ownership of the property that had been his for decades. When Nicholas had handed down his ruling, the courtroom had been full. not just with people interested in the case, but with those who'd come to see if he would falter. Beth Chambers hadn't been there. Though her lawyer had sat stiffly through the proceedings, his arguments perfunctory and lifeless, as if he'd already admitted defeat. But the consequences of Beth and Daniel's actions were only just beginning. A soft knock came at the door. Nicholas looked up as Mitchell stepped inside, carrying a folded newspaper. "You're in the headlines again, sir." Nicholas sighed faintly, though a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I imagine it isn't flattering." "Depends on who you ask," Mitchell replied, placing the newspaper on the desk. Nicholas unfolded it, his eyes landing on the bold headline. "Local judge faces down controversy, upholds justice." Below the headline was a grainy photo of Nicholas on the courthouse steps, surrounded by townspeople, some cheering, others watching quietly. He skimmed the article, noting how it tread carefully between telling the truth and avoiding offense. But one line stood out. Judge Gray's unwavering commitment to fairness has raised questions about those who challenged him, and what they hope to gain by doing so. Nicholas sat back, his fingers resting against the page. "It's a start," he murmured. Mitchell shifted awkwardly. "Speaking of those questions, have you heard about Officer Daniels?" Nicholas looked up, his brow lifting. "No. What about him?" Mitchell hesitated before answering. The sheriff's office launched an investigation into his conduct. Apparently, he had a habit of overstepping, but no one spoke up until now. The state police are involved. Nicholas absorbed this silently. Daniel's downfall wasn't surprising. Men like him often underestimated the cost of their own hubris. But hearing that his actions were being held accountable gave Nicholas a quiet sense of relief. "And Mrs. Chambers?" Nicholas asked, already knowing Mitchell would have an answer. Mitchell frowned slightly. "Her family's real estate dealings are under review. Seems they've been buying up land under questionable circumstances for years. The press is starting to dig deeper. People are talking." Nicholas nodded, his expression neutral, though inside he felt a faint spark of satisfaction. Beth's accusations, her baseless attempt to tear him down, had backfired spectacularly. The truth had not only exposed her, but cast a long shadow over her family's influence. That afternoon, Nicholas took a walk through Tanner's Creek. The town felt different, subtly so, but enough that he noticed it. People who might have once ignored him now offered small nods of acknowledgement. Others hesitated as he passed, uncertainty in their eyes. He stopped briefly at the diner. Through the window, he could see Donna bustling between tables, her ponytail bouncing as she served coffee. She caught sight of him and waved enthusiastically, gesturing for him to come in. Nicholas shook his head with a smile, pointing down the street. He wasn't ready for small talk just yet. Instead, he made his way toward the edge of town, where Thomas Greer's modest house sat nestled among trees. The old farmer was on his porch, rocking slowly in a wooden chair, his hat pulled low over his brow. Nicholas approached, the gravel crunching underfoot. Thomas looked up, his eyes lighting up with quiet recognition. "Judge Gray," he said, rising to his feet. "Mr. Greer," Nicholas replied warmly, extending a hand. Thomas shook it firmly, gratitude etched into the deep lines of his face. "You didn't have to come out here," Thomas said, his voice low but steady. Nicholas shrugged. "I wanted to. How are things?" Thomas gestured toward the fields stretching behind the house. "Better than they've been in a long time. Thanks to you." He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "You didn't just give me back my land, Judge. You gave me back my dignity." Nicholas felt the weight of those words, his chest tightening. "It was yours all along. I just made sure they couldn't take it from you." Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he looked out over the fields. "Not everyone would have fought the way you did. Most would have folded under the pressure." Nicholas smiled faintly. "I've spent too much of my life fighting to stop now." The two men stood in companionable silence for a moment, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees filling the space between them. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "You ever wonder why it always has to be this hard?" Nicholas turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "Every day. But if we don't stand up to it, if we don't push back, nothing ever changes." Thomas nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. That evening, Nicholas returned to the courthouse one last time before the day ended. The halls were quiet now, the setting sun casting long shadows across the marble floors. He walked slowly, absorbing the stillness of the place he'd fought so hard to defend. Stopping outside Courtroom B, he rested his hand against the doorframe. This room, his room, had tested him, tried to break him, but it hadn't succeeded. He was still here. Mitchell appeared behind him, his voice soft. "Heading out, Judge?" Nicholas turned, offering a small nod. "I think I've earned a quiet night." Mitchell grinned. "You sure have. I'll lock up." Nicholas paused as he turned to leave. "Mitchell." The young clerk stopped. "Yes, sir?" Nicholas met his gaze, his voice steady. "Don't ever let them shake you. No matter what they say, no matter how loud they get, you stand firm. You hear me?" Mitchell's grin faded into something more serious. "I hear you, sir." Nicholas smiled faintly before stepping out into the evening air. As he drove home, Nicholas let the events of the past few days play in his mind like a film reel. Beth's accusations, Daniel's intimidation, the whispers of doubt that had followed him like shadows. But in the end, the truth had won. He had won. For now, at least. He knew there would be other battles, other people like Beth and Daniels who would try to tear him down, to discredit everything he had worked for. But Nicholas was ready. As he pulled into the driveway of his home, the sky above him painted in deep hues of orange and purple, he felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. The fight for justice was never truly over, but tonight he could rest. He stepped out of the car and paused for a moment, staring out at the horizon. The wind stirred the trees gently, carrying with it the faint hum of the town he had sworn to serve and protect. A town that, for the first time in a long time, was beginning to see him not just as a judge, but as a man who would not be moved. The stars were just beginning to dot the night sky as Nicholas Gray sat on the back porch of his home, the quiet hum of crickets providing the soundtrack to his thoughts. The town of Tanner's Creek, nestled under a blanket of darkness, seemed at peace. From here, it was easy to forget the tensions that had rattled its foundations just days ago. Nicholas rocked slowly in the weathered wooden chair his father had built decades earlier, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The events of the past week played out in his mind like a series of snapshots. Beth Chambers' accusations, Officer Daniel's arrogant challenge, the whispers that tried to sow doubt in his integrity. And yet, here he was, still standing. Nicholas had faced battles his entire life. Being born into a small southern town with dark skin and big dreams had taught him early on that his presence would often be questioned, his abilities dismissed before he ever had a chance to prove himself. "You've got to be twice as good to get half as far," his father used to say, the words etched into Nicholas' soul like an unshakable mantra. So he had been twice as good, and when that wasn't enough, he had been better. Every challenge he overcame, graduating at the top of his law school class, earning the respect of his peers, earning his seat on the bench, had been a victory not just for him, but for every child who looked like him and dared to dream of more. But victories didn't erase the weight of the world he carried. Nicholas had long accepted that his authority would always be questioned by people like Beth Chambers and Officer Daniels. People who couldn't reconcile the sight of a black man commanding a courtroom or holding the law in his hands. They feared him not because of what he had done, but because of what he represented. But this time had been different. This time, the weight had felt heavier. Beth's accusations and Daniel's attempts to humiliate him had been public, weaponizing old prejudices that never fully disappeared. He had been tested not just as a judge, but as a man, as someone who carried generations of struggle on his back every time he stepped into that courtroom. And yet, Nicholas had not broken. The day after his ruling in favor of Thomas Greer, Nicholas received a letter from a young law student who had been present during the proceedings. It was handwritten in careful print, and Nicholas had reread it more times than he cared to admit. "Dear Judge Gray, I wanted to say thank you. I sat in your courtroom this week and watched you stand tall when it seemed like the world wanted you to fall. I'm a first-year law student, and there are days when I wonder if I belong in this field, if I'll ever be taken seriously as a black woman in the legal system. But when I watched you, I saw strength. I saw dignity. I saw someone who wouldn't let the world decide his worth. You reminded me why I started this journey. Thank you. Nicholas had folded the letter carefully, placing it in the drawer of his desk alongside other small keepsakes that mattered far more than plaques or awards. It was a reminder that his fight, however personal it felt, was never just about him. Tanner's Creek had been shaken. The revelation that Officer Daniels had overstepped his authority wasn't just embarrassing for the sheriff's department. It was a reckoning. Complaints about Daniels' misconduct had surfaced in the days after the confrontation, as people who had once stayed silent found the courage to speak. For years, Daniels had used his badge as a shield, bending the rules and flexing his power over those who didn't have the means to fight back. Now, he was suspended pending a full investigation. Some whispered that he'd leave town quietly, unable to withstand the scrutiny he'd brought on himself. As for Beth Chambers, her family's empire had taken its first real hit. The press dug into her business dealings, uncovering a trail of shady transactions and strong-arm tactics. She had fled Tanner's Creek for now, retreating to the safety of silence. But Nicholas knew she wasn't gone forever. People like Beth always found ways to rebuild their power. Still, her defeat was symbolic. It sent a message that Tanner's Creek wasn't the same town it had been. People were paying attention now, questioning the systems that had gone unchecked for so long. For Nicholas, the battle had always been larger than the courtroom. It was about justice, not the fragile kind that buckled under pressure, but the kind that stood firm no matter how loud the opposition became. It was about the people who couldn't fight for themselves, the ones who had been silenced or ignored for too long. Sitting on his porch, Nicholas thought of Thomas Greer. He imagined the man standing in his fields at dawn, surveying the land that was finally, undisputedly his. The quiet pride in Thomas's face when Nicholas had ruled in his favor was something Nicholas would never forget. He also thought of the law student who had written to him, of every young black boy or girl who might one day see him and think, if he can stand tall, so can I. Nicholas exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of his responsibilities settle into something more bearable. He wasn't naive enough to think the fight was over. There would always be another Beth Chambers, another Officer Daniels, another system that tried to undermine the people it claimed to protect. But Nicholas would be ready. The next morning, as Nicholas walked up the courthouse steps, he noticed something new. A small group of townspeople had gathered outside the building. Nothing formal, just neighbors talking quietly among themselves. When they saw him, the conversations paused. A man in a work jacket nodded respectfully. "Morning, Judge Gray." "Morning," Nicholas replied, offering a small nod in return. An older woman leaned against the railing, her eyes kind. "We're glad you didn't back down." Nicholas smiled faintly, his voice warm but firm. "Neither should you." The woman smiled back, as though understanding his meaning perfectly. Inside, Mitchell was waiting with a fresh docket of cases, his face bright as ever. "Busy day ahead, sir." Nicholas accepted the files, glancing through them as they walked toward the courtroom. "That's how I like it," Nicholas replied. Before he stepped through the doors, he paused for a brief moment, taking in the sight of the empty courtroom bathed in morning light. This space, the bench, the walls, the gavel that waited for his hand, was more than just wood and brick. It was his responsibility, his platform, his purpose. Nicholas took his seat, adjusting his robe as the room slowly began to fill. Lawyers arranged their papers, clients whispered nervously, and townspeople settled into their places. It was another day in Tanner's Creek, but the weight of yesterday still lingered. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice steady and clear. Nicholas looked out at the faces before him. Some were familiar, others new, but they were all watching him, waiting for his voice to command the room. "This court is now in session," Nicholas said, his tone strong and even. He had won this battle, but there would be others, and Nicholas Gray would be ready to meet them, just as he always had. Justice, resilience, dignity in the face of adversity. Nicholas' journey was not about triumphing over individual adversaries, but standing firm against a system that too often favored the powerful over the powerless. His story was a reminder that progress, while slow and uneven, comes from persistence. And sometimes, All it takes to inspire change is one man refusing to back down.